Thanks very much, Ellen, for having me, and to ISA as well. I was a founding member of ISA in Sydney, and I would like to pay tribute to Anne Moyle. I remember her very vividly speaking to us, and my impression was, boy, can this woman use language. The only person who I would compare her to in public is Dame Leonie Kramer, a friend of mine and a fan of my poetry, and I think Anne is extraordinary. I would like to think they taught me how to speak in public, but after that I must say I do fail. I was on the committee of ISA. In my opinion, it was a dysfunctional committee. The people on it did not know how to run a committee properly or chair. There was one person who snuck around in the background and was not officially on the committee and manipulated things from the background. I account myself responsible there partly for problems. Independent scholars, I'd like to say something about that. ISA was not founded to be the Retired Academics Association. What an independent scholar is can vary quite a lot. Anyway, I would encourage the widest view, but an independent scholar should, in my opinion, give due course to others. You don't impose your views on other people, and you don't behave in a nasty or aggressive way to other people. I saw some of that in Sydney. Computers. This is just preliminary. I'll get onto it in a minute. Computers. I know I'm going to be asked this question. If you've got problems with computers, join a computer club. There's a Mac club in Canberra and there is a PC club. I have founded a constant users group at the National Library. It has an email and it will have a website. That has now been founded. This is my computer assistant, Pras. Pras, come up here, please. Pras is from India and he's studying, is it business?
Yes.
And Pras can help you if you've got any problems, but you have to pay. You want to speak a bit?
No, that's all.
Okay. As a poet, just to warm up, I would like to read 3 poems. Very quickly, they're not long. The first one is called The National Library. And this is the 3rd poem I've written about the library. The National Library. Here you have Australia in your hand. And the second one was written yesterday, and I read in The Australian the obituary of Sir Peter Maxwell Davies, and it's all in the poem, I don't have to say anything. Elegy for Peter, in memory of Sir Peter Maxwell Davies, a British composer who was Master of the Queen's Museum. The boat has now left the harbour. I'll never touch your fingers again. You've gone tits up. And the third one was also written in Canberra yesterday. Driving around Canberra. All in circles or with squares. I'm the author of 2 encyclopedias, which Alan didn't mention, an Encyclopedia of Male Homosexual Poetry and an Encyclopedia of Male Homosexual Art. The art one is still being worked on. The poetry one took 20 years to write and came to 1 million words. And it was, it covered the world systematically, continent by continent, language group by language group. There are 247 languages and language groups dealt with. Leonie Kramer, when she saw Tamil, she said, "Are you sure you aren't doing things wrongly here or whatever, there were 13 Tamil entries. It's in a database, and a database is like a card system which can be entered in multiple fields. You can look at it at the National Library, and I checked it the other day and it worked, unlike when I tried to use it at the National Library after it was published in 2002, and it didn't work. And it was at 6 p.m. on a Friday, the library I think opened then, or one night, and nobody could be found to help me. I also used it in the Library of Congress. The same thing happened. That made me pretty mad. I also want to tell you it has not been cited in one scholarly work in 14 years. And I'm pretty mad about that. Very mad. And I think it shows vast incompetence of scholars. If I'd have found this work, I would have called it up, and it's in libraries on many continents. I would have called the work up and I would have insisted on seeing it. But they don't do it. Now, the genesis of a gay history of the world. A gay history of the world is subtitled Human Male Homosexuality, a World History. Gay is an identity. Homosexuality is a behaviour, in my view. What was the genesis of this crazy work? Well, a psychologist told me when I was living in New Zealand, your whole life has been an attempt to get back at what your mother said to you aged 12 or 13. And what she said to me when she was telling me the facts of life, so-called, totally hopelessly, and my father and grandmother also told me the facts of life, totally hopelessly. My mother had read the Kinsey reports, and I read them too. Sneakily, she said to me, she knew I played around with boys. She said to me, or one boy, and I told her, she said to me, I don't want you to grow up a poofter. They're the lowest of the low. Right. Now, I'm not sure that was the genesis. I would date my gay identity from the age of 5. If you speak to teachers, they will tell you. They know the gay ones at age 6. However, the immediate genesis of the history was a book published by Robert Eldridge, Dr. Robert Eldridge of Sydney Uni, who is now Professor Robert Eldridge, Professor of European History. And Robert I knew through the gay history group at Sydney Uni. He and Gary Wotherspoon, who's just published a Gay History of Sydney, organised gay history seminars. And people came from all over the world, and one is now a jailbird, Walter Williams. He was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. Must have been pretty ghastly what he did. We won't go into Walter Williams, but he's in jail. Robert published a book called Gay Life and Culture, a World History. And Robert and I had a kind of antagonistic relationship due to something in the past. I regard Robert as a difficult person, but a very genuine scholar and a very good gay scholar, and quite helpful. And my own personality came into this. Great scholars are frequently difficult people, as you know, very difficult. Anyway, he publishes this book, Gay Life and Culture, a World History. That was in 2007. And he would have known, he knew about my Encyclopedia of Male Homosexual Poetry. He knew about it, he'd have to know, because I was an honorary associate at Sydney University, and I worked on this for 20 years. 20 years. It was all my own money. I paid for research assistants. Anyway, so Robert publishes this book, And I picked it up, and 9 of the 14 chapters were on Europe. And there was the usual genuflection to East Asia, China and Japan. One was kind of on tribal cultures, one was on Islam, and one was called The Contemporary Gay World by one of the leading scholars in the Netherlands. And then there was the introduction. Well, I read the introduction, and that made me really furious, because Australia was only briefly mentioned. He's living in Australia, he's an American. Maybe we won't put this on the internet. And New Zealand was left out. Anyway, I was pretty upset, because he knew about my work, which came to 1 million words. There are 2 other, I won't say mine's a great work, there are 2 great gay works which have been published in Sydney. And one is Gary Symes's bibliography of homosexuality in the University of Sydney Library. That was published in 1998. It was an annotated bibliography, and it extended Wayne Dines' bibliography of 1987, which is the first annotated bibliography of homosexuality, and it had world coverage, or virtually. And Wayne's one of my greatest friends. He lives in New York. He's now 80, and he edited the Encyclopedia of Homosexuality, published in 1990, for which I wrote 2 articles. So I decided to write a review, and I rang I contacted the Journal of Homosexuality, and through my scholarly contact in the United States, I knew a bit about the editor, who was very elderly. And he said, "Oh yeah, write that. Yeah, you can write it." How long? Oh, a couple of thousand words. So I set to work, and it took me 6 weeks to write the review, which grew to 6,000 words, 8,000. And I contacted, "Oh no, it has to be cut, that's 6,000, so I cut it." And he fell off a ladder at the age of 80. And it was taken over by a new editor, a smart postmodernist, I assume. And I sent him an email, and I didn't get a reply. Now, in this day and age, I would have got on the phone to San Francisco through my mobile, but I didn't do it. And I was pretty upset, because if he'd have read my email, he would have seen it being a commission review. Anyway, what happened was that review never got published, but it's now on the internet. You can read the review on the internet. And, okay, well, that's enough on that. Anyway, Robert is, I think, furious with me. He refused to return a letter. He's entitled to do what he wants to do. I'm entitled to do mine. I'm entitled to have my opinion. But writing that review set me to thinking, how would you write a gay history of the world? And I thought, well, one way to do it would be by country. And there's 193 countries in the world. And it so happened I was staying with an old friend waiting to move into a unit in Sydney, and I had 6 weeks to spare. So I went out to Macquarie Uni, and I went to WorldCat. You know what WorldCat is probably. If you don't, WorldCat, WORLDCAT. It's got 300 million library records on it. It's a union catalogue of the world's research libraries. And I put in homosexuality, Argentina. Then I printed out what came up. And I was amazed. I was amazed. And I then started folders on each country. Anyway, this project lapsed. And in 2008, I bought the unit. In 2011, I had what you might call as a personal crisis. It's not the time or the place to go into this. And I had to work out how I could make some money quickly. And I thought, well, a gay history of the world's going to sell, and I'll do it in 3 months. No works, 3 months, 3 countries a day. And anyway, I'd been looking around for somewhere to buy, and I decided to go to New Zealand for a holiday. And the Aussie dollar was high then, it was 1.25 to the New Zealand dollar. And it was cheaper to live in Auckland than Sydney. So I had a small flat. I had a lot of money in the bank because I'd sold my unit. And interest rates were high, 5.8%. And I started writing. And I wrote day and night. Some of it was written in the middle of the night. I emailed Wayne constantly. Wayne was my mentor, you might say, and he was bombarded with emails, and at one time he told me to fuck off. And I thought, oh my God, that's the type of person he is. Anyway, he wrote, and I thought, oh, that's when I adopted the motto, nil desperandum, never despair. Anyway, Wayne, 10 days later, apologised. Anyway, Wayne is now 80. He has a great library near Columbia Uni. It's a Grace and Favour apartment here. It's under rent control from when he worked at Columbia. So when I started the history, I thought, well, I'm in New Zealand. There's all these little countries around it. Fiji, the Cook Islands, well, that may or may not be a country. The Solomon Islands. And so I started on those as recce's. And I kind of worked out after a while, well, firstly, you have to say, what's the state of the legalisation of homosexuality in a country? Because Britain once controlled a quarter of the world, and the British laws, totally unjust for homosexuals and gays, were transferred. And as you may know, that homosexuality was illegal in Britain until 1967, with the death penalty until I think 1860, and the life penalty after that. And certain offences were not decriminalised until 1885, when things like mutual masturbation and stuff like that got criminalised, and that's what Wilde was tried under. He wasn't tried for anal sex, he wasn't tried for that. And Europe laughed at Britain. Homosexuality was legal in France, it was legal in Italy. There were light penalties in Russia, 3 months banishment, and they just laughed. And the British, and Britain, from the gay point of view, Britain is not a just society. And I can tell you, we feel, every gay person I know in the scholarly world or of influence, we all feel the same. We're not happy. So anyway, the history came out at 740,000 words 3 years later. 193 countries, and it's arranged from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe. And every country has the following layout. Is homosexuality legal? It's not legal in 67 countries. There's a big row in India. The Delhi High Court decriminalised it under the British law introduced in 1860, right, which spread to Malaysia, by the way, to Singapore, where it's still illegal, despite Singapore having a huge gay community, and at least one prominent figure, very prominent figure in Singapore, being gay. Very prominent figure. Very. So, anyway, in the history, I found out that India had a 3,000-year-old tolerant tradition of homosexuality under Hinduism. 3,000 years. Then the British come, it's illegal, people carry on in a homophobic way. Anyway, the case has now been remitted back to the Supreme Court of India, and they're going to make a judgment. And Pras, my assistant, tells me that they're going to legalise gay marriage. Homosexuality is illegal, but they're going to legalise gay marriage. But anyway, we'll see what happens. In China, which has had a tolerant tradition, China never sent people to the stake. You were never burnt alive for homosexuality, as you were in Spain, in France, and in Italy. And the last case in Deshofer DESCHAFFAURS, was in the last case in France, which caused an absolute uproar and led to decriminalisation in 1791, was about 1740. He was burnt alive at the stake. And in the midst of all this, lesbianism was never criminalised. Never. Because women don't matter. It doesn't matter what they do. But men have to pass on the seed. Okay. The definition of homosexuality. You might call me a definition queen. You do not attempt any subject without defining your terms. I haven't defined history, but that's the narrative of the past. Something like that. Oh, sorry, I haven't explained the layout of each country. Is it legal? A little bit about other laws, but that can go on and on. Censorship has occurred. In Britain, it was illegal to read gay books until the 70s. We gays were denied our history under British law. Denied our history and could go to jail up to life. And we're talking here, Britain, India, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South America. And it goes on and on. Zimbabwe, where there's a huge fight going on. Huge fight in Africa. Huge, right across the continent. Influenced by South Africa, which has a gay archives and a great constitution. The constitution, the third constitution, as a proper constitution, was made by the people. Not like our constitution, which is a law made in Britain. Our constitution is an act of the British Parliament. We don't have a proper constitution. So anyway, definition of homosexuality. The definition was based on Kinsey's Sexual Behaviour in the Human Mind, which was published in 1948, which is the largest survey of sexuality ever. Still, he had 5,000 cases. It caused a furor. People, when read it, said I could believe anything of anybody. It only dealt with people between the age of 16 and 65. And sexual behaviour can occur well before 16 and well after 65, like Picasso had a child at 83. So Kinsey defined homosexuality as sexual and affectional relations between persons of the same sex. Sexual and affectional. Now, as Bill Percy of Boston, a great friend of mine, an assistant editor of the Encyclopedia of Homosexuality, pointed out to me, that's ambiguous. Does he mean sexual relations which are affectional, or sexual relations and affectional relations? So I changed the definition after speaking to Bill. I used Kinsey's definition for my Encyclopedia of Male Homosexual Poetry, which deals, and its reception history, it deals with not only the background, but sources of information, and there is an entry on homosexuality in it. Anyway, I changed the definition to the following: sexual and or strong affectional relations between persons of the same sex. And I was influenced there by a huge debate that's going on, by reading of poetry. The idea of mateship in Australia, there's a row going on there. Is mateship inherently homosexual or isn't it? And the point about this is, when do affectional relations, strong same-sex affectional relations, become homosexual? And a great scholar at Sydney Uni pointed out to me, oh, your definition's Freudian. Well, okay. So I hope I'm not confused. Okay, so that's the definition. And in the, well anyway, just we deal with the bit more pertinent stuff in the history. Australia is the longest country at 66,000 words. And Australia could not be cut. But it's my homeland, my native land, and there is inherently a bias in any work towards your native land. I've got a database, Dictionary of Australian Gays. Gough Whitlam is outed. I know Gough was gay. I know a great deal about Australian Prime Ministers. A great deal. They can sue me. You can't sue a dead person. The family can do what they want. Whitlam does not belong to the family. He belongs to Australia. And he outed himself. He said the following: Margaret and I are the most out couple. This was a promise of going to first nights in Sydney. But it was the kind of witty thing Wilde would have said. And in the story of Whitlam's life, I think homosexuality could be relevant. It was even implied that he'd had a gay affair with Sir John Kerr. And this is on the front page of a book which had them, one was in drag, and neither party sued. You can imply things in cartoons, and look at cartoons in the last few weeks in the Australian papers. I'm not saying anything more, but you just look at some. The earliest, okay, somebody's going to ask me, what's the earliest reference to homosexuality? Well, the structure of the actual work, it's got an introduction and then it's got a chapter, Homosexuality Before Humanity. Now, the planet is 4.4 billion years old. We know that pretty certainly. Life began 600 million years ago, relatively recently. Lucy, an early progenitor of humanity, is about 2 million years old, 2 million years ago, very late in the Earth's life. And 100,000 years ago, we had Homo sapiens. That is, the brain had developed to the capacity where it could think. And from then, of course, we had dramatic development. I don't know when language came. We had art. And 50,000 years ago, it's going back further and further, the Australian Aborigines reached Australia and they had a developed culture, very developed, by 40,000 years, because the piece of ochre given by Rhys Jones in the museum is 40,000 years old, and we know it was used in religious rituals. Art. An Aboriginal painting exists in Laura, that's 37,000 years old, Laura in North Queensland. And that painting has not been touched up. This came out at the SEA conference in Melbourne, which I attended. Now I've got this other encyclopedia, Encyclopedia of Male Homosexual Art. The first edition's been published, again in a database. I can't talk about a database now, you can check that out. That's in the National Library. I'm working on the second edition. I hope to finish it. It'll be a shorter work than the poetry, but it's got 9,300 entries. And the SEA, the Comité International de l'Histoire de l'Art, was founded in Paris in 1896 as a conference of art historians. And they meet every 4 years. And in Melbourne, they had a conference in 2008, which I attended, organised by Janie Anderson, a great figure at Melbourne Uni, who was in the poo and got demoted from the chair because she couldn't administer. But she organised the conference, and at one of the sessions, the Vice-Chancellor got up and said, "We're very proud of Janie Anderson." Anyway, behind the scenes, other stuff was going on. But anyway, sounds like Australia, Parliament House. Wild parties, jumping on tables. Anyway, at that conference, there was a debate which went on, which I helped initiate at the beginning. When I asked a question at the plenary, the opening plenary, what was the oldest work of art in the world? And she announced at Melbourne Town Hall that there was an Aboriginal art painting dated 37,000 years back. And then, immortally, the director of the British Museum, the gay director, Neil McGregor, spoke at one of the sessions, which was attended by Ron Radford and the director of the National Gallery and the director of the Getty, and he produced a slide of an axe, right, like that, and he said that's 1.5 million years old and it's art. So art goes right through everything. Pope Benedict has in fact said beauty will save us. He's an intellectual, whatever you think of Pope Benedict. I make no comment on his sexuality. I make no comment. So anyway, the earliest reference what is the earliest reference to homosexuality? That's tricky. It may be the Gilgamesh epic, which goes back to 2000 BC, but there's problems because the surviving version is only 600 BC. We can't date it beyond that. The cuneiforms can't be dated from the fall of the palace of Ashurbanipal. But it goes back, and the part in there is Gilgamesh's lament for Enkidu. And in the surviving version occur the lines, and it was Anne Fairbairn, the Australian poet, who drew my attention to this. You were the axe in my side. Have you got it? Axe. And anyway, and also there's a strong affectional relations between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, which would bring in their being gay. On my definition. Don't have your definition. Well, then another issue is what is sexual. Kinsey talked about, for Kinsey, sexuality had to end in orgasm. Not kissing, orgasm. Ancient Egypt has some old poems. They're difficult today. India's got a 3,000 tradition. China, similarly. When we get to Homer, 700 BC, about that, that's when it get interesting. Because in my poetry encyclopedia, I found that there was a debate from the 5th century BC as to whether in the Iliad Achilles was the Erastes or Patroclus. Erastes and Eromenos are the ancient Greek words for homosexuality, and they kind of mean senior partner and junior partner. It's kind of hard to define them. They could mean fuck or fucky, something like that. But the debate was not about the homoerotic relationship, were they gay or not. It was about what type of homosexual relationship it was. Anyway, at 600 BC, we get the first Greek poems. And these poems are frequently pederastic or pedophilic, love directed to young people, wine boys, Theognis, and so on. Theognis, by the way, wrote these poems to his lover Cernus. They're very dour and bitter poems, and they're about how to... He was exiled, I think, and anyway, so we won't go on. We'll try and finish pretty soon. The P word. Well, you can guess what that is, pedophilia. Now, I define pedophilia along with colleagues in the gay world, and we gays talk incessantly about this. The scholarly gays, we all have our opinion. We talk incessantly. We talk about our own sex lives. It's going on right in the background and be going on all over Australia. If you read the Australian today, Gary Dowsett and the manual that's come out where it says kids' identities form between 11 and 13 by that time, etc. Stirring. So I define pedophilia as sex under the age of puberty. Puberty is a varying feast. Some people go through it early, others go through it late, but roughly sex before teenage years. Pederasty is another type of homosexuality, and that is sex roughly between an older person and a younger person, but really more sex between an older person and a post-pubescent teenager. And in my Encyclopedia of Male Homosexual Poetry, I found a huge volume of pederastic poetry. Huge. Pedophilia is very rare. Pederasty occurs in excuse me, occurs in Greek. So Greece, Arabic, right? It occurs in the Middle East. Turkish. It occurs in Hebrew. It occurs in Chinese. It occurs in Japanese. We are also up here with the age of death. The age of death was about 30 till recently. So a pederast in ancient Greece was not like a pederast could be today. A pederast could be somebody who's 50 or 60 or even 70 or 80. My view, I take a libertarian view about sexual behaviour. If it's mutually agreeable, there's nothing wrong with it. However, I have an issue with when a young person could consent, but our laws aren't like this. Pedophilia is now a pedophile is somebody who has sex below the legal age of sexual consent. Legal age, sexual consent. Not the legal age you can own a gun or drive a car. And by the way, a child is defined in United Nations statutes as somebody below the age of 18. Well, that's not a child, in my view. Sexuality, it's been said, is a garden, and it is infinitely varied. And the state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation. It's not for you or I to dictate to others their sexuality. There's a famous case in the literature of a culture. There's 30,000 cultures in the world. There's 193 countries, but 30,000 is about the ballpark figure that I've been able to find out. 10,000 languages are known, living and dead. That's in the Encyclopedia of Language and Linguistics, Volume 10, they're all listed. I found out about that in the Poetry Encyclopedia. I had to know, how many languages are there? It's a question that came up in my own mind. What happened? And of course, I've dealt with 247 languages and language families, so I'm a dickhead. I haven't dealt with the 10,000. As the database, as the history is in one sequence and is available on Smashwords, you can search it for any word you could think of. And by hyperlinks, it could be linked to Wikipedia entries. And I'll give you one example, fisting. Now, I'm not going to go into here what fisting is. It's a gay sexual practice, and it's a heterosexual one probably too. I think it occurs 5 times. Now, the afterlife of the publication, the history was published in June last year, and it's bombed. And I'm working on that with press. There's a lot of issues. However, A libel was one. There's 193 jurisdictions. It's on the internet. It's going through all of those. So it's going to be illegal in some of them. It's going to be whatever. I don't know, but you know, I'm not taking it down. I'm not going to be not going to be stood over. I was involved in the gay rights lobby in Sydney, and I regard myself as a gay activist and still a gay activist. I have checked out 4 countries. I was, of course, terrified that every country, you know, oh, you left out this, you left out that. Fiji, after finishing, I went to Fiji for 3 weeks. And I was zonked. I could barely talk. And anyway, in Fiji, I travelled around. Tragic country. Tragic. I'd been to Samoa the previous year, which had been under New Zealand control, and democracy was working. And it was affluent. Fiji is a basket case. Anyway, I tracked down one of the leading gay activists, and he had a look at it all, had a look at Fiji, and he said, it's good, it's okay. Couldn't find many mistakes. But one mistake was, a friend of mine told me in Sydney, men are seen walking around hand in hand. And he said Fiji has a vibrant gay scene. It doesn't have a vibrant gay scene. It's had a coup culture since 1987. There's one bar you might go to in Suva. The atmosphere is pretty grim. It's returned to democracy. But it doesn't have a vibrant gay culture at all. So I've changed Fiji for the 2nd edition. After finishing the history, I went to Britain to do a course in digital humanities at London. That, for various reasons, that didn't come about. But I went through Southeast Asia, and when I was in Indonesia, I went to West Papua, by the way, fabulous country, or province, as it is at present. I flew to Surabaya to see the leading gay activist. I flew from West Papua to Surabaya via Makassar or somewhere. And anyway, it wasn't that difficult, by the way. And you just go to the airport and buy the ticket. It's pretty easy. Anyway, Dede Atome is the leading gay activist, and I had him lined up to meet. And Dede told me, no problems. No problems. And he's going to translate Indonesia into Indonesian. Canada caused a lot of problems. I've got contacts in Canada with the Canadian Gay Archives, and Ian Young, one of the great gay bibliographers of gay literature. And Canada was hard to write. I could do the historical part to the 20th century, and I didn't know how to deal with the 20th century. So I got the Canadian entries from I've got another database called Famous Homosexuals and Bisexuals. And I'd done a lot of work on Canada. I wrote to the Canadian gay paper, and they published the letter. And I got emails from lots of people in Canada. And they said things like, good on you for doing this, and so on. Ian Young, truly one of the great figures of contemporary gay culture, is a close friend of mine. And I visited him a couple of times in Ontario. He's also a poet, as a gay liberation poet. He gave me lots of help, and he's just looked at Canada. I don't let the digital text, no digital text goes, because once it goes, it can be sent around. But you have to trust some people. Ian has looked at Canada, and he came up with one mistake. And that mistake is not that bad. It was a guy called Alder, and I said he was involved in the Maple Leaf Gardens affair. Maple Leaf Gardens was when a number of men were arrested for having sex with, I think, 17-year-old or 18-year-old male hustlers. And at that stage, when Canada decriminalised in 1969, the beginnings of gay liberation, which is the movement that the modern gay world dates from, when Canada decriminalised, it was at 21, as it was in Britain. Parliament deigned to allow men over 21 to have consenting sex. As you know now, if you have sex, if I had sex with a 15-year-old, it would be rape. It would be sexual abuse, quote, of children. So anyway, Canada came out okay. New Zealand, oh my God. New Zealand has been vetted by one of the greatest living gay scholars. When I went to New Zealand, his name's Tony Millett, and he's formidable. He takes no, old Chicago saying, take no shit from no one. Well, Tony doesn't take any crap. He's a librarian. And I knew about his bibliography of New Zealand. He'd actually done two, and I had them. I had the second one. And before I left Sydney for New Zealand, I checked him out on the internet, and he had a website. And I sent him an email. And I was only in Auckland 3 hours, and I'd met him. And I'll never forget it. I'd booked into this cheap place, and anyway, he came. I was coming out, and I looked over and I saw this guy coming down. It was just before 5 o'clock or something. And I thought, I wonder if that's Tony Millett, Anthony Millett. And I went over and said, are you Tony Millett? He said, yes. And he became a good friend. And I said, you've written a bibliography of homosexuality in New Zealand, you know. What have you got to say? And it was 1995 it was published or something. Oh no, he said, I've updated that. It's on the internet. And I said, what? I couldn't find it. Oh no, that's in Find NZ Articles. Find NZ Articles, all one word. So I got on the internet. And I couldn't get it. Couldn't ring it up. Right? We're all done with the internet. The internet, this computer in 1990, my then research assistant said to me, that's like a 747 plane. So what you know about the internet, you know about 0.1%, and I know, maybe know, I don't know. We know very little. We're playing with a 747 plane. Hope we don't crash. So anyway, after a bit of hassle and stuff, I finally got onto it, and I said, now listen, Tony, you've published this work. It was then at 2,600 entries. You've published it in digital form, and nobody can get to it. So he put on his site the URL, and we had discussions. And I said, well, I think you should publish it in hard copy, paper copy, which he did. And he typed the whole thing in, which is crazy. And he published the bibliography, and it's now up to 3,600 items. It is in a database. As I say, you'll have to check that out. I can't tell you what a database is. And it's got all the various subject entries, and it is the greatest country bibliography in the world. In fact, there's no country bibliography of male homosexuality. I think he's got lesbianism in too. There's no one. That's New Zealand. And New Zealand has published, Chris Brickell published A Gay History of New Zealand. Mine is the second. And it's been vetted by Tony, and he hasn't come up with, there were typos, but he hasn't come up with anything significant. Okay, that's it. So now over to you. Sorry, I've been taking so long. Ask any questions you want, I'll try and answer them. Any questions?
Well, it was a very frank account of your experiences as a scholar, and it would be worth having that for our journal, ISA review, if you could think of running it up.
I'm really pushed for time.
Oh, well,
I'll see what I can do.
It doesn't have to be straight away.
I'll see what I can do. I could do one or two pages. 1 or 2 pages, would that be okay? Describing it?
Yes.
2000 or 2000 he was born. Any other questions or comments? You can tell me I'm an idiot or I'm crazy or whatever.
Well, when two young girls under the age of 13 or pre-pubertal are close friends playing with each other, are they indulging in paedophilia?
Well, no, they're not.
You pardon?
Pedophilia, I call it pedophilia. P-E-D, not paedophilia. That comes from Greek word, it means Pisces, boy. Pedophilia involves an adult and a younger person.
Well, your definition of that didn't come out, but it's come out now with your answer.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's quite correct. I played around with this boy about the age of 10, and his mother came in and found us naked in the room or something like that. No, she found us naked, playing with each other. Baby girls masturbate, are you aware of that? They masturbate. A friend of mine told me this. I have nothing to do with baby girls, I'm not interested. But she told me this. The children are conceived in a sexual act, but that's just normal behaviour, kids playing around with each other, in my view. And I think...
You made mention of your mother's comment that she didn't want you to grow up a poofter. What was her attitude to you when she realised that you were...
She never realised.
She never?
Yeah, my parents were both alcoholics. In those days, I was too terrified to tell them. The person who did kind of realise was my grandmother, my mother's mother. It was a matriarchal structure. And the last thing she said before she died, it was the last conversation. She kind of brought me up, basically. An issue has come up, was my father gay? At my mother's funeral, he never talked to me, or they didn't talk to me. There's a Bergman film that ends, father spoke to me. At my mother's funeral, which was in our family hotel, she was drunk. She was an alcoholic at the time. I had to go up and run it. They called it Knobel's circus. It was just out of control. It's like something out of the 18th century. It was, anyway, she died suddenly. She had a heart attack. She died on the toilet. My grandmother, I went up to the hospital with my mother, and I came back and I went to my grandmother and I said, do not tell Dad. I will deal with that. She went straight up and told him. He said, she's dead. Very cruel. At my mother's funeral, which was held in the church where they married, Anglican church, then we went over to bury her. We were all in shell-shocked. I'd been writing a thesis on death in 20th century poetry, ha ha ha. And at the funeral, my father blurted out at the grave, she was the only woman I loved in my life. And I shamefully, and there was a gasp went up, I threw the dirt on the grave like that. I feel terrible about that to this very day. I really do. I mean, we have to be taught how to deal with death. And we're not. That's a whole other thing. That should be in the school curriculum. How do you deal with death? And then there are all these family conflicts and issues. Anyway, I did not tell my mother, but my grandmother kind of worked it out. And at her death when I was about 28, I inherited the family hotel by various means. I had to. My grandmother said, when I die, you've got 2 alcoholics on your hands. She lived with them. And my father was obviously an alcoholic. My mother, I didn't know. If I'd known she was an alcoholic, I'd never let her go back and run the hotel. A lease came up, and it was between lessees, and she went up to run it. And alarming stuff got back to me in Sydney. That she was being fleeced, she was being taken down, and my cousin said, I'm worried even for her health. So I had to fly out. Anyway, my grandmother, with the last effective conversation, went like this. It was the Christmas, I think, either Christmas or just after my father died.